Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm here with someone who will not be a stranger or will not be unknown to many of you who have followed my work for the last few years. I'm here with Kevin Orosz, who has been a collaborator with me on a project along with another one of our friends, Daniel Dick, in the Sex, Masculinity, God book, which is available. You can find it on philosophyportal.online if you're interested in checking out that project. But here we're today talking about a new project that Kevin has titled Primal Polarity. And we're going to use that project as a window, a conceptual window into talking about, say, sexual polarity, sexual dynamics in general. But first, to open up, Kevin, why don't you welcome yourself to those who may not be aware of your work? And then secondly, talk a little bit about this new project, Primal Polarity. What is it, and how does it connect to the rest of your spiritual journey, let's say?
Yeah, amazing to be here with you, Fidel. It's always great to have deep conversations with you. And yeah, it's very much connected to our book and kind of my interests over the last, 9 years of being a coach and consultant, speaker, and facilitator. I was doing a lot of the relationship work in the background during my coaching career, where I kind of just started as a, life coach, and then I moved more towards men's work, and then I actually moved towards entrepreneurs. I was supporting people in their business. But during that time, I was working with couples, working on polarity, intimacy, relationship work, and also singles, but I wasn't really promoting it. So I kind of made the decision last year to fully shift all my efforts towards relationship and intimacy work. And Primal Polarity is kind of the signature group program. It's an 8-week program that I run with one of my colleagues, Zach Gallardo. And we ran it last year and it was amazing. And so we're doing the upgraded version this year. And it's basically it's a bit of a crash course. So it's a co-ed space of practice and inquiry. It's a dojo where, we lay out the curriculum, theory, and practice. There's exercises and accountability groups. So you have men and women meeting and being vulnerable and going to their edge in terms of, things ranging from shadow work, attachment styles, erotic blueprints, to, polarizing communication, masculine, feminine dynamics, body language, how to text, how to approach on a dating app, how to approach in person. And then for couples, for people that are already in a relationship, it's really how to practice the art of polarity, which you can just think of as, it's the magnetic attractive field. It's that, zest of life that's often sexual in nature, high libido, high interest, that unfortunately most couples after the so-called honeymoon phase, or especially more mainstream folks that aren't, balls deep in things like philosophy or personal development or whatever, they seem to lose. And this is, I think, a part of why divorce rates and, sexual violence and abuse, and how many people report being quite, resentful or confused around masculine feminine dynamics, and it affects the relationships. So this course is like my kind of love letter to that, as in a basic 101 building blocks that you could take with you as your tool belt.
I think it's super important. And before we get into sort of the deeper, let's say, perhaps philosophical concepts and sort of speculations around primal polarity, I just want to inquire a little bit about what you've noticed in your spiritual journey as it relates to sexual dynamics and the spiritual community, because you've been, like you said, you've been a lot, you've had a lot of experience. You've said life coach, men's coach, business work, but you've also just been on a spiritual journey in general, right? Like, you've been around the world, you've explored different communities, you've become let's say, highly skilled in different spiritual practices, whether it's yoga, breathing, psychedelics, the list goes on. People who are familiar with that cultural niche will know sort of the toolbox that one can develop there. But what have you noticed in the spiritual community specifically as it relates to sexuality and how do people handle sexual polarity? Is it a topic that gets enough attention? Is it a topic where there's bypassing? What's your view here?
Yeah, I mean, I very much got into this work because it was my own pain point and very personal to me. I experienced a girlfriend that cheated on me and infidelity that really like kind of shattered my worldview very early and kind of red pilled me, because I was raised Catholic and took on some of those repressive kind of sexual ideas about, no sex before marriage and sex is unclean and blah, blah, blah. So that was very formative to me. So the reason I got so deep into it and started studying it, and also was attracted towards Tantra, which I got into through the vector of Qigong and then later yoga. So there's like the Taoist lineage of Tantra, and then there's the yogic lineage. And it was very deeply interesting to me. And that's why I got so into it. So it is very personal. Now, having been, yes, in these communities, the yoga, breathwork, meditation community, which is more of kind of the love and light side of things. And also the more, edgy communities like music, artists, the Burning Man kind of festival culture, as well as, the plant medicine community and psychedelic culture. I would say across the board, because it's at the base level of human experience, sexuality is always an issue for good or ill. And often in the spiritual community, because there's such, let us say, highfalutin ideas about self, like we're on the path of enlightenment, we're on the path of awakening, we are the ones, there's this big kind of grandiosity that I've fallen into myself in the past. I'm not immune to this. I've become a bit more of now I do stand-up comedy as well. And I use my comedy sets are based on roasting these people, including myself in the past. And now I still have blind spots. So I'm not immune to the shadow, but what's really pervasive is this idea of non-monogamy. Consensual non-monogamy is the new buzzword, or polyamory. And I see this causing a lot of issues, to the point where being a spiritual fuckboy or a spiritual, thirst trap as a woman is kind of a meme now, because in the kind of, like, hey baby, you want to come to my yoga class? Like this like silly idea that the spiritual pickup artist and the spiritual, bad bitch, and the amount of, abandonment, attachment styles, codependency flaring up, the trauma of open relating as it's practiced by people who frankly, weren't that great at monogamy and having one partner, and then they just kind of open Pandora's box. So that's a big one. I think also like spiritual couples on the light side do have a better fighting chance at maintaining high polarity and forming a strong bond and long-term relationship. Because what I see when I work with more of a couple, that has no practice, so like meditation, what's that? Or, I just go to work and I pay my bills. When they encounter relationship issues, especially on the emotional plane, it's really tough, because they might just go to a traditional therapist or go towards pharmaceuticals or what have you. Whereas a couple that, has practices, they have some kind of embodiment practice, they know how to move their emotions, they're into health and wellness, they're into communication, they have a much better chance of actually working through the issues. And so that's what I really find with, this community.
Fantastic overview, and thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, there's so many different little windows there that you open that I would be fun to explore. And it's also very interesting. And also I want to mention for the viewers that I think your perspective is very valuable, because you've experienced such a range of different approaches to sexuality. And I think that, moving forward is going to give you, in some sense, an interesting viewpoint on cultural war issues and different sort of ways in which people are struggling with sexuality. I think what was interesting to me, not only was it sort of your perspective coming from a very repressive Christian culture, going to the opposite, being a sort of tantric point of view, and then seeing all of the negativities in sexuality, which in some sense also gives a perspective on why certain cultures would become repressive about sexuality. Is like the reason behind the repression is this negativity, which is the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, as it relates to sexuality. But one thing I want to emphasize here is the one thing you emphasized of, across the board, whether we're talking about, let's say, monotheistic repression, whether we're talking, and this of course came up in Sex, Masculinity, and God, but whether we're talking about monotheistic repression or we're talking about hedonistic spirituality, sexuality has a certain problematic nature to it. Like that is not like a way you could pick where you could avoid the problematic nature, as it were. Like it's kind of like pick your poison, pick your, pick how you want to approach this, but it's there's no easy way out, is what I'm trying to say. There's no easy escape route, is what I'm trying to say. And on the one hand, with the monotheistic side of things, you could say that the ego inflates itself into God. And then on the spiritual side of things, maybe you inflate your ego itself. And so there's these two inflations that are possible on the most extreme side of things, which is trying to deal with this sexual contradiction conundrum at the core, at the most important core of our being, right? And I think that's like why we titled the book Sex, Masculinity, and God, is because sex is kind of the root, and sex is the core, and then you have our gender identities, and then you have the highest telos that you could strive for, and somehow thinking about all of these together is something that's incredibly difficult. So in regards to, I guess, want to start with, in regards to, your experience in the spiritual communities where there's a lot of consensual non-monogamy, and like the way you talk about, spiritual fuckboys and spiritual thirst traps, and another really important point you brought up is people who are not very good at monogamy jumping into Pandora's box and polyamory, because that doesn't really logically make any sense, because you want to get monogamy right before you do anything beyond monogamy, right? It's like, I'm not very good at relating to the other sex. Let me relate to many people in the opposite sex all at once. That will work. No. So broadly speaking, the question I want to ask is, you recently had a Facebook post where you asked the question, why are so many attractive, successful people getting divorced, living isolated, or struggling with dating? And I think that this is a question that a lot of people, they could be highly educated, they could be successful in many, many dimensions, but for some reason they find themselves alone. For some reason they find themselves divorced. For some reason they find themselves unable to interact with the opposite sex. Set me your big picture vision of what's going on here from your experience and from what you're doing now.
Yeah, if I had to sum it up in a sentence, it's we lack a holistic approach to emotional intelligence and processing emotion, especially the negative side of emotion. And when you're sexually bonded with someone, so you're dating someone and you're connecting, and all the stuff happens on the neurochemical level. There's all these hormones and neurotransmitters that are literally designed by evolution to bond you to that person, quite literally. Like you are fixated upon them in an attachment, because that's pair bonding, right? This is like what continues the species. Like we pair bond, we create children, and then we raise the children. And that's something you can't stop. You can't outthink your physiology. Like it's extremely powerful. So there's that dimension. And then there's the unconscious, right? And the personal subconscious, whatever flavor of Jungian, Freudian, whatever side you want to look at. There's all these images and powerful emotions that project onto the other. And so that becomes this whole battlefield of, my dad didn't love me when I was 6. I wanted him to come to my baseball game, or my mom was very invasive and kind of like smothered me with her helicopter parenting and whatever. Like there's those very strong imagos of mother, father that come into a transference in the couple. And these are titanic issues that cannot be, smoked away, drank away, ignored. You can't just do talk therapy with them. So it's a very somatic experience. And that's why people, they feel the adage is right. Falling in love is like going insane. It's like you go crazy. It's because it's irrational. And so people don't have a relationship to the irrational or the subconscious or emotional dimension unless you've gone deep into one of these kind of paths, right? You've gone into psychedelics, you've gone into tantra, you've gone into self-inquiry or philosophy or meditation. And then you can actually like start to wrestle with that dragon a little bit because you have some tools and you have some awareness. But most people, they're just on a railroad track in life. And I see this with clients all the time. The images fed to us, which I term propaganda, through Hollywood and through, the mass marketing apparatus has been perfected in many ways over the last 100 years. And it sold us this idea that you'll meet the one, you'll marry her or him, you'll have kids, and it's happily ever after. Like, you're done. That's a complete kind of like set piece in the theater that we're shown through these images. But the reality is, in that relationship, it's very hard to control libidinal urges and also navigate the dynamics of codependency, trauma bonding, this push-pull dynamic. And so many people, the way they deal with it is, they either avoid it or they go so deeply into it that it disempowers them often. So we have things like avoiding it through cheating. So I'll just find someone else. Maybe that'll work. Or it's like, okay, this person is my everything, but then it becomes like a mother-son relationship or a father-daughter relationship where like you kind of become their therapist, their protector, their provider, their emotional support, their emotional doormat. And then the polarity's gone because you don't want to fuck the other if there's a disempowered state, and you lose that that zest and that mystery and the like attractive kind of psychological mating dynamics that bonded you in the first place. And so this is why so many people are unable, I find, to navigate it. And it's why the divorce rate is, I think, now like 55% or something. And there's some stat put out, I don't know if it was Psychology America or something, but there's more women than ever who will choose to be single rather than even date or have sex with a man that they deem to be unworthy. And so more women are single than ever. And more men are sexless than ever. So for men, it's not even about, oh, I'm not even in a relationship. They're not even having sex at all. They're not even going on dates. And these statistics, since they started measuring them, have like, it's alarming.
Those stats are alarming, and it's quite disturbing to think about where that might be heading. And like, even, when you study sort of the most extreme forms of accelerationist philosophy, it's like not like that there's nothing we can do about it. Like that we're doomed in this trajectory. Like that there's something going on here at a deeper level, but we don't need to get into that. I mean, in some sense, I see the work you're doing, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is because I see the work you're doing as a necessary in this situation. Absolutely necessary. And, I like that, the main thing here is a philosophical focus on holistic processing of emotions, specifically negative emotions, because usually when I was first exposed to, let's say, spiritual holism, there's a way in which I see this spiritual philosophy, as it were, creating a holistic image that gets rid of negative emotions. But I like that you're emphasizing a holistic approach that includes negative emotions. We can't have a holism without the negativity. We have to have a holism with that negativity. And specifically, also, the holistic philosophy can tend towards a view of reality which is, let's say, obfuscating or denying evolutionary reality. And I like that you're emphasizing that the processing of these emotions has to be within accepting sort of our evolutionary programming and the way in which we are, in some sense, pre-programmed to hyper-fixate and hyper-attach to the other in a way that confronts us necessarily with psychoanalysis, whatever school, whatever approach, whatever methodology, we need to take on board to approach the unconscious mind, this is a battlefield. And I think that that is something that requires perhaps something like you already emphasized, that cannot just be handled in the clinic, in the traditional psychoanalytic clinic. So when it comes to primal polarity and wrestling with that dragon, what are some of the things that you've seen, and what are some of the tips and tricks that you're developing, or that people could expect to take on board if they, for example, joined your primal polarity program?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of parse it out into three main buckets, and they build on one another. And obviously there's so much nuance here, but the first step is like self-awareness. And it's like, it's an inside job. This is what I always tell people. The most common thing I hear, the litany, more from women than men, actually, although both say it, is there are no good men, or there are no good women. Where are all the high quality, attractive, conscious men, right, or women? And this is a pretty silly idea, although I get it. They are in demand and they are rare compared to the mass population. So I do understand why that's an idea. I used to have this idea. But the way you meet a high quality partner, say you're on the dating market right now, is you become a high quality partner. It's not that you just stay the same and you're static and you just shop for, like, it's like the shopping idea. It's like, I'll just go to the store and find the best product. This is not how it works. So the first step is self-awareness. You need to do shadow work. As you said, you have to pick your own style. Psychoanalysis is an amazing path of shadow work. Tantra is an amazing path of shadow work. There's many paths, but shadow work, in my definition, is just you have awareness of your blind spots and traumas, many of which form in early childhood, ages 0 to 7. And they have to deal with the next step, which is, what's your attachment style? Are you more anxious attached? Are you more avoidant attached? Are you secure attached? Are you disorganized attachment? There's all the new research coming out on attachment style, and it's basically how we learn to bond to our primary caregivers. And it reflects deeply later on in life in sexual relationships. And then you need to just understand some of your flavors and your desires. So a lot of people aren't even aware of what they like and what turns them on. Their kinks on the one extreme side, or just like the simple little things that they need, like owning that they have needs and desires. And you need to make an inventory of that. You need to be curious about that and do self-inquiry. So that's kind of the first step. And for some people, that could take years. If you've never looked at this or even considered it, and you open that doorway, yeah, there might be a lot of stuff you work through. You may not even be ready for a committed partnership or like a union type relationship, because you've got some stuff to work through. And so, that leads right into the next one, which is you need community. So the problem with many relationships is they exist in a vacuum, where the couple attempts to become its own kind of solar system of everything, which always was embedded in the matrix of the village or the community or the tribe, and specifically with the men and women. So men need to be around men. They need to be in men's work. We've seen this firsthand in the men's work events that we've been a part of together. Women need to be around women. They need to be deeply connected to women and women's work and women's circles. And they need to have their own self-resourced friendships and alliances with others to create if you're dating, that's how you're going to meet the best partners, is through the community of like-minded, like-hearted people. And B, once you're dating and in a relationship, that community is going to hold you in accountability and integrity and support, and provides you a place to go to outside of the pair bond to move through the emotional, toughness and the tough parts of that relationship. So that's another big one. Now, on the practical side of polarity, I do teach, I kind of, I've been through the whole pickup artist thing. I've read all the red pill literature. I think it is valuable on some level, the sexual market dynamics and, all the masculine, feminine kind of traditionalist like views. I mean, it's funny now with the culture wars and this whole woke thing and the big conversation around gender and transgender. And, it's like a headline every day now. A lot of people are living in that post-Me Too reality where women are rising up, stoning men, just like casting down anyone that's even close to what they would label a narcissist or a toxic or whatever. And then men are very afraid now to exhibit masculine qualities because they don't want to be seen as toxic. They want to be more of the white knight, the good boy. And women similarly want to be seen as the good girl. But their sexual habits and desires are anything but. And so you come up against this problem where how can you be in integrity and be honest while dating and entering a sexual relationship, while also understanding the evolutionary mating dynamics that are driving your psychology and physiology, and then practice that in real time. And so what I teach is like, for men, it's like you need to actually develop your masculine side. You don't need to like focus on being this perfectly balanced good boy. You need to become more decisive, directed. You need to be in leadership. You need to be in providence and protection of the feminine and lead your own life that way. And this will make you a very desirable partner. Even when you're with your woman, you will attract other women, but you're choosing her, right? That's the key dynamic. For the feminine, for women, they need to focus on the feminine. They need to really embody and open their heart and be receptive and surrendered. And then, it moves towards, devotion and submission. And then for the man, it moves towards dominance, which these can be, trigger words, because a lot of people have experienced trauma through, dominance and submission, where it wasn't connected up to the heart. It was done non-consensually, boundaries were crossed. So when you're texting, when you're on a dating app, when you're in person and you're meeting someone, your body language, your eye contact, your language has to reflect these like polarizing dynamics. And then once you've like, all right, we're dating, we're going to be together. Now they have to be implemented inside the relationship. A lot of people just turn it off once they get the girl or get the guy, right? And then it's sweatpants and Netflix, and you don't want to fuck at that point. So it is like picking up a practice, and like any practice, repetition is going to be what you need to continue to keep the flame alive and actually increase it. You open up a whole dimension of development, of personal development, when you're practicing, healthy communication, emotional intelligence, sexual embodiment with a partner.
So no sweatpants and Netflix is not at the ground floor of primal polarity. Is that right?
I mean, if you're fully embodied, sweatpants and Netflix can be sexy.
Could be. Context dependent. Okay. All right. So let's go back to these steps that you're working through here. So the first step in the primal polarity is self-awareness. So basically to get out of projecting onto the other. We do have a tendency in the culture wars to have a very and in sexuality, I think this comes out fundamentally, and it can be sublimated unconsciously into ideological battles, but this tendency to a one-sidedness where you're either a masculinist, you're a feminist. And if you're a masculinist, the women are the problem. If you're a feminist, the men are the problem. And so there's this one-sidedness which needs to be broken through self-awareness, which involves sort of confronting, some of the more, let's say, uncomfortable dimensions of oneself. And I think that what was interesting in your sort of overview there was, your emphasis that even though we're in a type of, let's say, post-religious or don't know how to say it, like not a traditional religious society in the sense that the society is in some sense dominated by the religious notion, that everyone still wants to be seen as a good boy or girl. It's almost like the unconscious believes for us, like we have these ideas that you still want to be seen as the good, in contrast to the dirty or the bad or the ugly, which is often related to sexuality. And in fact, I had a conversation with a friend on the channel last week, John Eshinove, who wrote a fiction book which was articulating this same strange dynamic, which is coming up in the culture. And then the second step you articulated is, first step, the self-awareness, the second step, the community dynamics and sort of the relationships that hold our sexual relationship, and that there's this tendency towards becoming an atomized couple, where the man doesn't have deep male friendships, the woman doesn't have female friendships, and there's no larger community dynamic to hold. When it comes to the first, maybe I'll say, what's the relationship between the first and the second step? And in regards to the self-awareness angle, how much of a problem is it for people who discover desires, kinks, weird dimensions of themselves when they're already in a relationship, and that might disrupt the relationship? And then on the other hand, with the community dynamics, including your primal polarity group, everything is so virtualized. Community is so virtualized. And that is so, it's difficult to actually, like, do we have, like, we're being torn between the physical and the virtual into the virtual, it seems. And how does that play into these? I think that's also disorienting for people.
100%, 100%. On that note, it is about in-person community is the primary, and that should be everyone's goal. It is tough though. A lot of people, another question I hear all the time, it's like, there's no men's groups in my area or my town. There's no women's circles. It's like, okay, start one. You have to take agency there. And that's what I really recommend. And I give a little starter kit. It's like, all right, you need to gather at least 2 men or 2 women, ideally 3, because the 3 creates a great dynamic, and start it if there isn't one. It can be virtual though. A lot of people, can get a lot even here on Zoom by being in, that communitas energy of the village, the tribe, the men and women's circle. So the community aspect, it's like, you do have to effort to get there, and you have to be out there. You have to be visible. You have to be consistent, and you will meet people. You just need to meet one person. And through, like, the law of, association, you'll meet someone else through them, and it will continue and it'll proliferate. You just have to show up. 80% of that is just showing up. The self-awareness piece is key to that though, because if you haven't done any self-inquiry, so you've never considered what your desires are, what your hurts and traumas, your pain, which is driving a lot of your behavior, most people, it comes down to sex, money, and power. And sex has a lot to do with power. I think sex also has a lot to do with money, but sex and money kind of where they get distilled. And so your relationship to those energetics and your wounds around them and your desires and, what you're into and what you spend your time doing, who you're having sex with, what you're doing for your work, how you're seen as an authority or as a figure of power and influence in your small community, even the 5 people that are closest to you is where I would start, are going to determine how you would even date, be in a community, be embedded in a village, how you would navigate a relationship. So without that first step, it's an inside job. You have to have self-awareness. Otherwise, when you enter communities, you'll enter communities that aren't correct for you. They're not even in alignment, but you do them just through association. Oh, these are my colleagues at work. Oh, this is who I grew up with in high school. And often those dynamics can hold you back in life because you're just taking on their beliefs often, subliminally. It's like you're just assuming that's how everyone is. And so it is a piece where you have to choose your partners and your community. And obviously some of that is up to your circumstance, of course, but you have agency. And so you need to exercise it. Now to the point of, if you've never done this kind of work and you're in a marriage of many years and you suddenly discover that you are into BDSM or shibari or, you want to become tantric, this can be an upheaval in that relationship. And so I always give the disclaimer when I work with someone, because I've seen it happen many times. Often after our coaching agreement ends, something will happen, an upheaval. So I always say, like, wait to make any life-changing decisions and try to integrate this information for minimum 90 days before you want to get a divorce or whatever, or like deepen the relationship. Maybe you've fallen really deeply in love and you want to get married, whatever. You have to understand that people grow at different rates. And one of the hardest things in a partnership is when one partner experiences asymmetrical growth at a rapid rate. And often the pattern I see is with the women. It's interesting that the statistics on consumer behavior, right? Like even in personal development, women purchase 80% or 90%, I've even heard, of personal development products, coaching, consulting, healing, retreats, workshops, et cetera, et cetera. It's similar with consumer products. Like females purchase 80% of all consumer products, home goods, blah, blah, blah. So women are more likely, in my experience, and over my career, I've had more female clients than male. Not by a large margin, it's probably like 60-40, but women are more likely to sign up for therapy, to sign up for coaching, to do a workshop or course on embodying their feminine and doing polarity. And then what happens is they will be like, I want my husband or my boyfriend to join me. And then he's like, the fuck is this? I can't, this is too much money. I'm trying to pay the bills. He's like, what is this shit? And I talk to these men and I'm always like, I need to speak with your partner. Like, I can't just in integrity work with you. If you're going to want to work together, you both need to be pot committed. And often men will just be like, you know, they have to get to a breaking point. A lot of men won't take action until there's so much pain or the fear of losing her to actually do it. And it's very unfortunate. And I also get it. If someone came to me and was like, hey, I'm working with your girlfriend, you know, she's having huge breakthroughs, you need to get your shit together and work with me. I'd be like, fuck you. You know, I'm like, I understand deeply why men react this way. I saw another relationship coach. I don't think I would do this post because I think it accomplishes the opposite of what I want. But he's like, I'm going to take screenshots of all the DMs your wives are sending me. He's like a big relationship coach. These are the messages your wives are sending me because they're so unhappy, unfucked, and miserable, and they want you to do the work. And it's like, it cuts to the bone. It hits different because it is the case in many cases.
This is an example of a holistic approaching of sexuality where you have to deal with the negative, and also the evolutionary dynamics at work, you know, like, because that was a lot of the things you were describing there. And I think in some sense, the hilarious tragedy of our situation is that and I think I've heard you talk about this on social media, but the hilarious tragedy of our situation being we have all of these evolutionary drives, often unconscious evolutionary drives, interacting within a high-level digital medium. And it's like the collision between the evolutionary drives and this global digital medium just produce insanity, basically. It's like, you know, this was, I don't think this was adequately theorized or anticipated by like the people who were building out the infrastructure of the internet. It's like, you know, like the people doing it weren't actually thinking about their evolutionary drives and stuff like that, but now they're sort of in some sense, on the one hand, a nightmarish situation, and on the other hand, an opportunity for deep growth. And oftentimes those do go together. But I'd like to talk a little bit more at length about some of the major issues that you see in starting the Primal Polarity, specifically around social media, dating apps, and some of the social norms they feed into, like hookup culture and porn and the shifting norms, you know, like, because on the one hand, I do think that there's a truth to what you say about us being sold the Disney picture of relationships growing up. But at the same time, I don't know how much that story is dominating contemporary culture. It seems the story dominating contemporary culture is much more related to the hookup culture. And, you know, sexuality without limits, and no more traditional norms anymore. And I think that this is very much a product of the last 10 years, maybe, because of, like you say, social media, dating apps and stuff like that. So could you speak to what you see here, and how you try to hold this energy in your Primal Polarity space?
Yeah, I think you're correct that dating apps and hookup culture have definitely predominated the younger generations. I do find that a lot of women from ages, let's say 25 to 45, there's, even though they might be living in that hookup culture, underneath it, when you strip away the layers and they get vulnerable, they're still waiting for Prince Charming though. So there is a pervasive Disney, program running in the background subtly. For men, it's a little less pervasive, although there is that action hero, like the badass that gets the girl and gets the job done. A lot of men are subconsciously acting that out, I think, in relationships, but there's less of the longing and the unrequited love and the romantic side. This is why for men, it's just porn. They just want to watch fucking. And that's what they're very visual. For women, it's romance novels. The women are the whole romance novel industry is porn for women. And what's the archetype there? It's every time, it's a dark, powerful man who takes the woman and like submits her to love and lust, and what are the most common romance novel like protagonists? The man, it's a fucking CEO billionaire, a vampire, or like a dark bad boy. There's like, that research is fascinating on the romance novel material, which, I look at stores and I look at the romance novel section. I'm like, how the fuck are they even, like, how is this in business? But apparently it's $1 billion industry. Just like porn though, women won't, they kind of read it in secret, or they'll buy it and be like, ooh, like, pass around these books. The problem, I think, is Esther Perel has a lot to say to this, who's an amazing speaker and, thought leader in this space. Everyone's become replaceable. So with Tinder and Bumble and Hinge and all these apps, and even with social media, it's sad to see that, you can just swipe right on something new. You can go like that thirst trap. You can meet someone. You're bombarded with ads like horny single women in your area, and you can just kind of go into this panoply of unlimited sexual desire. But it's very shallow. Like, you might be able to go out to a bar, buy a couple drinks, take someone home, have a sexual experience. It feels good. You get the rush of dopamine and bonding and whatever. And then you're right back where you started, feeling, kind of like alone, isolated, like unfulfilled. But then that has an addictive pattern where you can just keep doing that. And the replaceability has made it that, well, we'll just get a divorce, or, well, I'll just find a mistress, or I'll just move on to another man. And this mate switching has entered a pace where it's so prevalent that a lot of people are going celibate, especially in the spiritual community. And I do recommend this to some clients. I don't recommend celibacy per se, but I call it, in this theme of like John Wineland and David Data, they had the idea of a masculine or feminine cleanse or fast. So in order to break your patterns, these kind of runaway trains of, evolutionary energy, you need to actually just stop having sex with casual partners, or stop dating until you've kind of sorted yourself out and come to a very strong foundation where you can choose to date. And I actually make a distinction between dating and courtship. You can date for fun, be experimental, explore. I think it's very healthy in your 20s and 30s to do that. But at some point you want to enter courtship, where you're ready for a devotional, deep, loving experience that's based on growth and truth. And that's a very different dynamic than just swiping on apps. Now, there's forces at work here that I think are against this, not to get like conspiratorial, but, I know a lot of people in this field, relationship, dating, intimacy, their profiles do have some sexual imagery, right? So they'll have like, women that are topless, but in a tasteful way, whatever. It's more like erotic art. And they're speaking about, the deep love and polarity that's available. And those accounts will get flagged and banned. Meanwhile, and I still see these ads sometimes. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? I think the algorithm thinks that I want this stuff because I'm always posting about, these buzzwords. But there's these thirst trap social media accounts that are almost like softcore porn, where there's no like deep message. It's just, big busty women and, these men wearing boxer briefs. And those accounts have millions of followers. And they're able to run ads, and there's no, they don't get banned or shadow banned or blocked. And so it is weird that the social media organism, which, is just based on harvesting attention. I don't think there's necessarily someone like, ooh, let's suppress the people working on healthy sexuality and let's promote this. It's just purely based on attention. Those get more clicks and ad revenue. So I understand why they're emphasizing that, because they're based on profit. But that culture has really crippled men more than women. Women as the object of desire are in demand. So even a woman, you know, I tell this to all the women I work with, you could be, you know, overweight, not in the abject beauty standards, and you will still have a list of men that want to date you. And it's just true. If you're willing to receive them, it will be so. It may not be your ideal man, but those men will want to date you and, you know, make love to you. For men, it's much different because a man has to make something of himself and build his frame, his finances, his network, his authority, whatever, and be confident and actually pursue. And so unfortunately for many men, they just go to porn because it's like fast food, it's on demand. You know, 30% of all internet traffic is porn, apparently. It might be higher now, but that has crippled a generation of men who are learning unhealthy images about sex because it's all fucking fake. It's completely acting and just like ridiculous, you know, almost violent imagery often. That's not representative of what a real interaction with an emotionally bonded woman would be like. And, you know, because they're compulsively masturbating and ejaculating, it's draining their life force energy psychologically and physically. You know, they're spilling seed and projecting onto these images, and it's draining them. So they don't have the impetus to go out and build their business or increase their career, or train their body and mind and date high quality women. They can just go to Tinder and try to reenact these fantasy images. And, you know, for men's work, that's, I think, one of the big cruxes of our age is we do have to retrain and reinitiate, you know, generations of men.
Yeah, it's a good window there into the nightmare and the madness. I think that, again, thinking about this in the context of our evolutionary drives are basically unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, certainly informed by the past millions of years of sexual history. And boom, all of a sudden, a decade and global internet, digital connectivity, and all of these drives are circulating unconsciously in this new matrix. And all of a sudden, at the very same time as the emergence of a cultural war ideology, which tries to put the master signifier, what are the master signifiers of the current culture war ideology? Is diversity and inclusion. You know, and what's absolutely repressed is what? Polarity. So we have diversity and inclusion as the ideology. We have the unconscious real as polarity, which trigger people, like you say, like dominant submission patterns. And what do we need to bring to consciousness more than anything is actually not diversity and inclusion. It's polarity. So it's a very, very strange situation, a very, very strange culture war, which seems to me at its roots to involve the unconscious of sexuality and reconciling ourselves with the unconscious of sexuality, and specifically the notion of sexual difference as constituting polarity. And that actually is the opening of our book, Sex, Masculinity, and God, as we talk about sexual difference. And that's the ground of the book. And I think for good reason, I think that it stands as an important resource in this culture war times. So this sexual difference, as you're describing it, I think it requires us to maybe unpack it a little bit more because it's so important, is on the one hand, woman as object of desire being immediately in high demand, and man as, traditionally speaking, protector, provider, being unable to overcome the power of virtual immediacy, just gratification through basically jerking off to images, as a type of vampiric process where your energy is lost into the virtual void, quite literally. And paradoxically, you're unable to mediate that energy to become the man who would be attractive to a woman in the long term. So we've got deeply disturbed sexual difference split here. And it seems to me, and this is the question I want to run by you, is it seems to me the only solution, or the first step of the solution, has to be men mediating their sexual energy away from the vampiric process. Would you agree with that? How do you see a potential maturation of this sexual difference occurring?
Yeah, I mean, this is at the core of what men's work is and has been, levied as since the mythopoetic movement and Iron John and, the dawn of men's work, which is just bringing back the ancient rituals of rites of passage and initiation for men, which we experienced, at the beautiful death of the patriarchs, with the European men's movement, and also at Mannsein. We were able to see these rituals in action. They're extremely powerful. Unfortunately, nature is set up that women are initiated automatically by biology. When they bleed, when they become mothers, they're initiated into womanhood. So it's a clear distinction between girl and woman. For men, we have men right now with nuclear arsenals and financial instruments that could collapse economies, who are essentially at an emotional level still like a 13-year-old boy trying to get mom's attention. That's how I really look at it, if you want to break it down. Because a man can go to his grave without being initiated, because it doesn't come automatically. A man must be initiated by other men and by the village. And this involves a death and rebirth process of the masculine ego. It can involve fasting, ritual combat, vision quest, solitude, plant medicine, trials, tribulations, etc. This is at the core of the hero's journey, and what the masculine spirit yearns for is to make himself into something, to become a powerful man that can protect and provide for his woman, his children, his family.
Can I just quickly jump in to ask you about whether or not I totally agree with you about the men in initiation. I just wanted to ask about women and the pill and stopping the bleeding process, or subverting it, or that there's more and more technological innovations which are helping people, like in the most extreme example, you have the example of puberty blockers, and that's becoming a cultural war issue now, where if you don't want to experience your maturation through puberty, which was previously totally automatic, now it's in some sense subvertible. What do you think about that? Go on, but I just wanted to include that part to see if it how it sat with you.
Well, it is eerie to me, and like the transhumanist philosophy, which I know you're very familiar with, and the transgender movement, which, by the way, I think I've actually worked with transgender clients. I've worked with multiple women who transitioned to men, and we're doing men's work. And what was interesting to me is I just treated it completely normal. I was very, understanding. They were vulnerable with me, but the same principles applied in the masculine dynamics, and they were able to enact them with a feminine partner. So I know that it works. Masculine and feminine energy or energetics has nothing to do with genitalia and sexuality, although it does. But, on the higher level, that can work, and I've seen it. Now, that being said, I think technology through birth control, through these hormonal, innovations, that to me should only be used in a very nuanced basis that's based around high levels of personal sovereignty and choice. Like I'm not against people doing that on principle, but I do think there needs to be informed consent. Like if someone can't drive or buy alcohol, should they be able to change their physiology and block puberty? I think that is, to me, it is concerning. Now, that being said, birth control has been well studied, where women on birth control become masculinized in polarity because their body always thinks they're pregnant, if it's the old school style of the tech, the pharmaceutical, or some of these newer styles. It's putting hormones and chemicals that are foreign to the body that basically interrupt the natural cycle of a woman, which is her menstrual cycle, which deeply informs femininity. all the women I know, my partner who does this work with women, all the female coaches and therapists and somatic practitioners, they deeply teach women to be in that feminine and embrace it. The cyclical monthly cycle is deeply important to their physiology, health, and psychology and emotions, because they go through seasons. You know, they have their spring, summer, fall, and winter. They have these seasons that are constantly changing, and their emotional habits, their dating habits, their sexual habits are deeply connected to that. So when you shut it down through pharmaceuticals or surgery or technology, you've created a very interesting issue where these women are out of touch with that primal essence. And this creates a ton of problems in relating, is what I find. A lot of women, you know, will completely change their attraction pattern. And there's peer-reviewed studies on this too, after quitting birth control. So once they stop using birth control and their hormones re-regulate, they suddenly are attracted to more traditionally alpha, strong, integrous men, where formerly they might have been married to a quote unquote beta male who was fulfilling a more feminine role because they were forced into the masculine, because they were literally suppressing their hormonal systems, and their body was physiologically and emotionally unable to process the energy of a polarized relationship. I see this a lot, and I think a lot of women are now waking up to this. There's a big women's movement about, you know, women's health that is including this conversation around birth control. And birth control culturally had even more implications, because now women could be sexual partners to many without fear of pregnancy, and they could change their sexual habits and their dating partners. And so that created the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll cultural revolution of the 60s, where women could be sexually freed, which, you know, on principle, I think is a good thing. Like, they should be able to choose how they want to relate, like, awesome. But the side effects have come, the bill has come due. And I think a lot of women and men are actually much more moving backwards, well, backwards in a holistic way towards more of these primal ideas, because it's actually increasing their relationship health and happiness.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that is coming up for me there, specifically on this issue of the primal drives and the technology, is the way in which it disrupts and challenges our conventional notions of freedom. So on the one hand, when you have the revolution of the pill, or you have the revolution which basically a series of technological revolutions which basically free women from traditional roles and dynamics. And if you look at the 20th century literature and feminism, the narrative that you're going to get is this trying to break away from traditional constraints, right? And that traditional constraints have prevented women from being the astronaut, the engineer, the professor, the lawyer, the politician, the president, and so forth, which are occupied disproportionately by men, because women are relegated to the seasons, relegated to nature, specifically metaphorically related to as Mother Nature, as not cultural, as you know, and much more cyclical as opposed to linear. And building a professional career is more linear than cyclical in some way. And then on the other hand, finding that this freedom from the traditional constraints has a paradoxical form of slavery tied to it. And I think, like, for me, one of the tentative areas where I'm going to identify potentially where this slavery is, I don't know, because it's a deep philosophical conversation on freedom and what is freedom. But it seems like almost everyone now is a potential sex worker. It's like, you know what I mean? Like, and I just want to run that idea by you and see how it fits with you, because it's like, you know, you see more and more arguments on the line of now, well, women can just start an OnlyFans, or just start some sort of or do cam shows, or it doesn't even have to be like that. It could be sugar daddy relationships. There's an entire ecology here. It's probably far more disturbing and complex than I'm even aware of, but just that the body now is being commodified and everyone is potentially a sex worker, and it's just like pure sex drive with capitalist dynamics. And this seems to me to be where we need to rethink what it means to really be free, and what it is that we lost with simply submitting, as it were, to polarity and long-term polarity.
Yeah. I mean, I think the phenomenon of OnlyFans is fascinating. I've worked with women that have done this, and actually some men who have either done a version of, I guess you could call it sex work. Even sometimes it's non-sexual. There's no actual sexuality acts, but they are escorts or companions to people as a profession. On the side, a lot of women, I think, OnlyFans is initially very liberating because they are getting a lot of attention and financial compensation for their body and their beauty and their sexuality, which I think for some women is a powerful path of opening themselves and being, empowered, is how they term it. Now, what I've found with a lot of those women is similar to porn for men, the relationship you make with that virtual space and these men that are simping over you and, sending you mail or, paying you all this money for whatever their fetish is, you are treating yourself in that space as a commodity, as you're saying. You're commodifying your most sacred energy, which is your creative sexual life force. And they start to notice that that is impacting all their relationships negatively. It's impacting their own self-image. It's impacting, even if they're making a lot of money. Like I was talking to one woman, she was in the top 10% earners on OnlyFans, which the top 1% earners are making 7 figures. It's insane, but also, understandable. Of course they would be. When they stopped treating themselves as an object of desire for hire, that's when they met their partner. That's when they did their healing. That's when they actually opened up to real love, devotion, committed union, family, their real underneath desires that they didn't want to trade for just finance. And I don't think that industry it's not viable long term, because it's devoid of heart and it's devoid of emotional bonding, which even nature has set up together with the sexual space. So if you just virtualize sexuality and it's just a transaction and it's just based on desire and lust without those other components of companionship, devotion, emotional connection, safety, authenticity, you lose something. And it's very like subtle, but almost everyone I've talked to that has been in that space and come out of it has the same story.
So it seems to me like it would be worthwhile to, if you're open to it, unpack a little bit about what you think is going on with what I mentioned earlier about the ideology of the culture wars emphasizing diversity and inclusion, but actually what we need is polarity, and actually diversity and inclusion being something that could erode polarity. Because it's like, specifically with inclusion, you include everybody, there's no outside, there's no excluded. This leads to the idea of non-monogamous polyamory. You include, whereas when it comes to a long-term partnership, by definition, you exclude. And in some sense, in my experience, that's a pain point. Like when you were talking about that we need to confront, precisely, like, because when you were talking about the optimal male strategy, which I agree with, by the way, and the optimal male strategy being you want to be the type of man who could attract many women, but you pick one. Right? I think that is the in some sense the optimal strategy in some sense for a man. because as a young man, you don't really know what it's like to be desired or to be in demand. And so you do need to sort of satisfy that feeling of what it's like to be in demand. And then you need to be wise with that situation, which a lot of guys end up botching that whole process quite badly. But anyway, it's something that I think we do need to make more conscious. Whereas, like I say, when you have options and you pick one, that's based on exclusion. You're excluding many people, and you're creating a boundary. You're creating and that's not possible to create a sustained polarity without such a motion. What do you think is going on emotionally there that's so difficult when it comes to the difference between inclusion and exclusion?
Yeah, on the ideological level, the inclusive idea is I think it has its basis in virtue, right? People want to be good. They want to create communitas. It's a deep human desire. We're social beings. So I understand why people get so gung-ho about it. The trap is when you include everyone in decision-making and try to reach consensus, you completely stall any process of social or political or, decision-making processes get completely sabotaged. And you see this all the time in, these spiritual events and workshops and retreats. I've been to so many. I was just at Envision Festival in Costa Rica, and I saw this play out like clockwork. Well, everyone gets a chance to share in the big circle. And suddenly you're there for 6 hours. And half of the shares, over half of the shares, added nothing to the space. They actually just took away energy, and you're kind of left feeling like, oh, nothing's really happening. We want to move forward with the idea or the group, goals. So it's very dangerous to just promote inclusion just for its own sake. There needs to be wisdom and discernment around that for sure. In the sexual space, I liken it to a garden. If you want to grow crops, if you want to grow food and you want to cultivate energy and create growth, well, you have to create a container. You can't just dump a mound of dirt and plant seeds without any boundaries around it and expect fruit from that. So pair bonding, which we're wired for, we're not like a reptile where, they mate, the female lays eggs and the male fucks off and never sees her again. Even though a lot of animal species work this way, we're not just animals. So we pair bond as human beings, as super chimpanzee primates, and we're meant to actually rear children in the matrix of pair bonds in a village. And a village with a bunch of healthy pair bonds, holding the space for children, for the community values, for the community goals, is extremely resilient. And that's what the impetus for all the conscious communities and regenerative agriculture and living together in these community dynamics, that everyone I talk to, literally everyone here in Austin, Texas, where I've, all the places I've been, Mexico, Asia, Central America, even in Europe, everyone wants this. They want to build their own communities because they're sick of living in cities where it's homogenized, it's isolated, and the dating dynamics also reflect that. So the exclusion is important, to choose one person based on your desire and alignment and love, and then cultivate something together. And obviously you still have alliances and tribal relationships, but in the sexual space specifically, the energy is so precious, it's so powerful. It literally has the power to create human life. You have to create a boundary. You have to boundary that structure, like a garden, to grow something. And some people aren't interested in, having children and raising children or being in family dynamics, and they do want to live an alternative lifestyle. And, I respect that. But that's not the majority of people. That's the exception, not the rule. And so to set a whole societal impetus based on a few people that want alternative lifestyles is, it's ludicrous.
Mm. So it's kind of like in our era, the exception has become the rule.
In some sense.
Yeah. And since we've met and since we've had conversations about sex, masculinity, and God, there's always been this image, I feel, in you about intentional communities, people wanting to build intentional communities and what goes into that. And we've also always discussed most intentional communities don't work because of sexual, money, power dynamic issues. And now in the context of your own life, sort of moving towards roots and settling down as opposed to a nomadic way of life. How do you relate to this idea of intentional community now, and how are you approaching it in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it is still my vision and goal. It has been since I started my kind of path of awakening, where I was like, okay, I'm not going to go to grad school. I'm not going to be an academic. I'm not going to get a corporate job. I'm gonna have to cut my own path through the jungle here. And it's always been like, okay, we need to build a community. Like, we need to build our own community. Dunbar's number kind of energy, 150 to 200 people connected, living in a decentralized network with other communities like that, adding value and creating our own kind of principles and cultural standards that are not opposed to. We can still be symbiotic with Babylon, or, you know, the concrete jungle and the mainstream, but we're not fully participatory in it because it's not serving us. Many of its values and implications are toxic. And, you know, with accelerationist capitalism and, you know, the parlance of, you know, your everyday American city, it's not serving most people, even the people that are most behind it. And I think that's pretty evident to most people in the conscious community, or the people that are pursuing entrepreneurship, personal development, polarity, et cetera. Like, it's pervasive. Everyone wants the same thing. Everyone wants to have a community. I think the approaches to it have to be very different, though, than they have been. It's not just like, let's buy land, we'll grow avocados, we'll be polyamorous, we'll just live in a utopia. Like, that's been tried many times and almost all of them fail. The communities here in Austin, Texas, which is becoming a little bit of a hub of this kind of movement, let's say, there's a lot of people that have moved here from the coasts of America, where traditionally all the innovation in finance, creativity, art, et cetera, was all on the West Coast or the East Coast, you know, California, New York kind of vibes. Now, a lot of people have moved to the interior, to places like Colorado, you know, North Carolina, Texas, et cetera, Florida, you know, Miami and Austin being the two big hotspots, where people are approaching it a lot differently. They are much more interested in creating, you know, firm, grounded, let us say, more traditional pacts around finance, shared living spaces. So it's not like, let's live on a hippie commune. It's like, let's get the most powerful people together that are running businesses and let's collaborate. And they still, like, many are here are buying land together, but it's not like, you know, it's very like high tech. It's very decentralized. There's a lot more talks about blockchain and alternative currency and economic models. There's a lot more talks around like regenerative agriculture and permaculture. So like, let's get our food systems online. Let's get our finance systems online. Let's get our power grid. Let's get our community dynamics online, and, you know, have more individual like sovereignty, and not just like go into a melded, you know, homogenized space, but still form these alliances because it's in everyone's best interest. And basically, one of the theses right now in some of these groups and thinkers is like, we have to make ourselves so irreplaceable and valuable to the mainstream that we can still be economically and culturally viable outside of the mainstream structures. So it is about like business and producing things more than let's escape into a utopian kind of paradise, that kind of the 1960s idea we inherited.
Super, super fascinating. I suppose, is this what seems to be a type of dialectical reversal between the conscious intentional communities, which are anti-capitalistic in some sense, and now the emergence of conscious communities which are realizing that they can't fight capitalism, but they have to in some sense work with capitalism, and become more aware, more focused on business. Now, my first question there is in becoming, you know, more focused on business, in what sense is there a trap of just becoming subsumed into the already existing business dynamics and capitalist dynamics, which were being resisted as the ground of the conscious community in the first place? There's this idea, well, there's this joke, I suppose. First, I'll say that I think Frederick Jameson said it, but Slavoj Žižek's made it popular, is the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. That you know, the world will end and capitalism will just keep on spinning around. You know, but what's your take on this? What are the risks involved in this? But I want to emphasize strongly that in my own life as well, I definitely am coming down on the side that if you don't at least know and experiment with business and put yourself through that test, which involves a certain negativity, confronting a certain negativity in a maturation process through capital, that in some sense your knowledge is infantile in some sense.
Certainly. You know, this is why I became an entrepreneur. It's not an easy path. It's definitely not for everyone. Everyone doesn't need to start their own business. I would never recommend that. It's a very
that's also becoming an ideology. Everyone become an
right.
entrepreneur.
Right. And it's become popular because guys like Elon Musk and all these, you know, Silicon Valley characters like Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, they're popularizing these ideas and empowering people and inspiring them. And I think it's beautiful. The real like entrepreneurs that are cut from that cloth will rise up and do it regardless. I think other people will experiment with side hustles and alternative forms of income, which I think is awesome. I coach people on this. I think it's a great path. But it's more around the people that have had a lot of success. Like, for example, here, the people leading these community charges already had a lot of success in real estate, or let's call it game A capitalism and corporate. And they have, they're funded. They already have, you know, large portfolios, large amounts of capital. And then they're paying that forward, but kind of being the tips of the spear that set the infrastructure, which then, yeah, creates jobs, creates, you know, containers for other people to fill in roles and be a part of the community and, you know, earn a wage or, you know, add value in other ways. So, you know, we do have to change the way we do this idea of game A versus game B, which I know you've dabbled in the IDW with some of those folks. I do like the idea. It's not, you know, it's not being implemented yet, or like, we don't really understand how to navigate past these sex, money, and power obstacles, these big dragons, because they are pervasive. And it's tough to not just fall into profit for profit's sake, because as soon as there's a drive to get more and the greed motivation takes on, you know, that's what sinks a lot of these movements, is the founders have issues or the constituents have issues, and then like it creates a drama that people just, you know, they lose faith in the vision. So we have to land and ground everything in the communitas of a clean sexual space where there's sovereignty and personal responsibility and authenticity, a clear communication space and channel where we can actually approach things and reach something like a consensus to make decisions. And then the economic aspect is huge, which I'm very interested in Web3 and blockchain technology. I think it's still in its infancy. All the casino dynamics and trading dynamics and market dynamics have kind of like, you know, hamstrung it in many ways. And we've seen a lot of bad actors, you know, with all these failed crypto banks, and, you know, now even, you know, investment banks like Silicon Valley Bank are failing. So there is an economic kind of reckoning happening in real time right now. So I think we're going to be forced to innovate, and these communities will be forced into a confrontation with traditional capitalism. How can they take what's good, if there is good things about it, which I think, you know, the technological and innovation drive could be argued as like the one virtue in my mind. The like backstabbing and the predatory dynamics of it, though, we have to move past and innovate through. And I do believe the Buckminster Fuller mindset is it. It's like we need to innovate and create something new that will outmode it and actually outcompete it. It's not that we dismantle it and tear it down. We actually have to move forward and outcompete it with something. And so these ideas of symbiotic ecosystems and, you know, the game B architecture of, you know, positive sum games versus negative sum games, I think is the kind of like direction to go. But how that works on the ground floor and in reality, you know, remains to be seen.
Yeah, I'd just say for historical context, at least the way I've engaged this is that I've sort of critiqued the logic of game A versus game B. Like that was sort of my, like it's it's basically trying to hold the A-B logic, which is a contradictory logic. That if you have game A versus game B, you run into all sorts of weird paradoxes, both in game A and game B. And one of the things that annoys me a lot actually is the dynamic where someone who's made a lot of money in game A then becomes the philanthropist for dynamics of game B. And I think that's actually the dominant ideology of our time, is when you look at a Bill Gates or that's the best example. There's many examples to could give of like, I've made billions of dollars in game A. Now I'm going to dedicate my life to agricultural projects in Africa. It's like that's so common and prevalent now, and it's like it's a way of virtue signaling, I guess, is like, look how good I am. I'm dedicating my life to the impoverished peoples of the world and so forth. But no, there's no easy. That's why A-B logic, because there's no easy way. It just like, and so the one thing I wanted to say, there's no easy way out, and I wanted to. So you mentioned a few things. One, I like the way you outlined what goes wrong with these communities. Like basically, there's founders have issues, the constituents have issues, and the vision falls apart. It's not grounded. But then when it comes to the ground, developing clean sexual spaces, clear communication spaces, it seems to me like that's where you get to an impossibility. What does it mean to have a clean sexual space? And is it possible to have completely clear communication, especially in sexuality? Zizek's made, I think, a quite interesting observation that if you have completely transparent communication, sexuality would disappear. That sexuality requires some implicit, something not clear, something obscure, something not said. Like, of course, if you're in a romantic relationship and you're going on a date and you haven't had sex before, you don't directly say, we're going to have sex tonight. There's a lot of ambiguity. Are we? There's a tension, there's a pull and pull. It's not directly inferred. There's a funny joke in Seinfeld that I always tell where George Costanza's driving his date home after dinner, and it's midnight, and the date says, we've had such a great date. Would you like to come up for coffee? And George says, oh no, I don't drink coffee this late at night. And then the woman looks disappointed and goes up, and then he's like, coffee didn't mean coffee, coffee meant sex. So what's your thoughts on, could you go into a little more detail with clean sexual spaces and clear communication? Because obviously there's some truth to needing that.
Well, the clean sexual space, like clean in this sense, maybe is the wrong signifier, but it's like sovereign sexual spaces where you can have a community where some people are into BDSM and kink, some people are polyamorous, but the understanding and the field of the group, the emotional space of the group is clear and clean, and that there's not these traumatic dynamics running it and sabotaging other processes that are inherently important, such as the financials, the food, the whatever. So this just requires, there's no easy fix to this other than individuals and sexual partners having high levels of self-responsibility, ownership, and extreme authenticity, where they can still navigate sexual spaces with, power and directness without it sabotaging and taking us into the swamp of jealousy and he said, she said, and deception and all the other stuff that usually sabotages the spaces. So that's why it just comes back full circle to like the importance of primal polarity and doing emotional relationship intimacy work, is so you can navigate and hold yourself in those spaces. Like a perfect example is like, myself and my partner were deeply monogamous and devoted to each other. And that's both a value we share deeply. In certain spaces, like we're at this festival in Costa Rica, or we go to these meetups where there's a lot of different sexual styles on display. There's people, tripping balls on psychedelics, having, group sex experiences and stuff like that. And we can still be in that space together because we have strong boundaries. Like we're not going to get offended if like someone wants to, like hit on us or like try to like, whatever. It's like we're so firm in our boundaries and we know ourselves And they know themselves too. Like I do respect some of those people, even though I don't, partake in those behaviors. They're able to have a reasonable, rational conversation, not take it personally. We can still be friends. We could even maybe do business together. And we need that kind of dynamic in these communities. And I think a lot of communities, this is part of their manifesto or core founding principles, is like, this has to be one of them, the sexual, energetic. The communication piece is, I think, even more fundamental, because it's how we reach group consensus and decision making. This is the main problem with these communities, is how do we make decisions? How do we allocate funds and finance? How do we choose the visions and goals of the group? Because the only thing that unites a group historically, if you even go back to like hunter-gatherer bands, was the shared group goals. Like, we don't want to starve. We want to have food and be warm. We want to keep away from that tribe that wants to, scalp us or take our women and children. We have to have a sense of like defense almost against the core drives of like scarcity, violence, etc. So there has to be a shared group vision and goal. And so how do we communicate that? If someone in the group believes we should be a communist commune where everything's free and open and we should have no money, that's going to be inherently opposed to the dialectic of someone who's like, well, no, like everyone here needs to add value. Like, you have your gifts, you have what you're good at. We want to create a symbiotic environment where everyone's giving their gifts, adding to the group energy, but there's still sovereignty around finance and money. And I think the only solution I've seen that has any kind of shot at this is the blockchain technology. I'm not promoting any cryptocurrency or any specific, project, but the technology itself as an open, transparent ledger, a way to transact, a way to store value that's outside of, the US dollar or the ruble or the rupiah and all these, debt-based, currencies that are out there that are fractional reserve banking and a whole fucking rabbit hole of game dynamics that are negative sum or zero sum. We do need a positive sum way to keep track of energy. And the only way we can do that is to have communication. So it's about group dynamics to reach decision making. And I don't see a way to do that without exclusion. There has to be some decision makers that are self-selected, group selected. There's many different styles around this, who are stewarding. They're stewards rather than like the dominator or CEO archetype. So they have proven themselves in some kind of group dynamic to have virtue or have some ability to have the group goals in mind and make informed decisions based on that with the group as a whole, without every single person giving their 2-hour talk of why we should grow potatoes instead of celery. And like, that takes up all the group space. And now no one has the impetus to actually make things happen. So it's a very fine line between let's include everyone as a kind of hippie commune utopia versus let's get shit done and like make moves, right?
I mean, I'm almost to the point where I would say that the word group, even the word community, is a little problematic, because it seems to me like what is actually, like especially when you're talking about the way things are going down in Austin, Texas, in the high tech sort of dynamic, it's more like network dynamics, where there are a multiplicity of different leaders or authorities that are making big decisions and forging alliances. And like, if you get like a group of people together to like each give their 2-hour talk on should we grow potatoes or whatever, is like, that's just a way to, nothing will ever happen.
Yeah.
So like for example, like, it's like, what I see is the primacy of a network, that there are different nodes in the network. Those nodes are people who take business responsibility. And then it's up to the people who have assumed some business responsibility to forge alliances with each other, which are mutually beneficial for both businesses. What do you think of that model?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how it's playing out. The people that already have influence and capital are just moving forward, and they're naturally attracting different kind of like schools of fish that are following them because they're interested in the same thing. I had a podcast actually last year with Jordan Hall, who's a fascinating thinker. He's a big part of the kind of Game B IDW scene and kind of an OG. He was building Web 1 back in the day. But we had this talk, and his idea on this is, this idea of kuleana, which is a Hawaiian word, which is like similar to dharma, and that kuleana is your unique offering and gift. And the ideal community structure in these intentional community kind of ideas is everyone's in their kuleana. And certain people, their kuleana is actually leadership. Like, we need people who are literally breaking the earth and tilling the soil, and they're amazing with growing plants. And so they will provide food, or they're raising animals and hopefully caring for them, and also, butchering them for their meat or hunting them. Though there's people that need to do that. There's kuleana is childcare. There's doulas, midwives, mothers, wise women that their whole thing is childcare. They actually wouldn't be the kind of governor of the financial or economic dynamics. And so there is this kind of idea that American individualist dream psychology is given, that you can be anything. Anyone can be president if you just work hard and just have a big dream, which on one level is true, I suppose. But in a community dynamic, there's a level of radical honesty, which is like, what are your literal skills and gifts? What are you interested in doing? And are you willing to do that in the community hierarchy or holarchy, right? We don't want to create a pyramid scheme where like all the power is concentrated at the top and we have these abuses of power, but we also can't have everyone doing everything. So it comes back to deep self-awareness and self-knowledge, where you must know thyself if you want to play in the group and create an alternative dynamic. And, this becomes difficult for some people because they think they have the idea, oh, I should be leading the workshop space, or I should be one of the leaders in the space. Well, it's like, no, actually, you were an accountant before you came to Game B. You need to help us like financially regulate our system so everyone's protected. That's actually what you're best at. Can you support us with that? Well, no, I want to be the chieftain. It's like, well, you don't have those skills. You want to be that, but that's not your best value set, right? So I think it's a fascinating idea. Something like that, I think, would work, but there's still going to be tensions, and people are still going to believe they're more competent than they are, or they're going to disagree with the person that's in power and they want to do it a different way.
All right. So, I mean, it's interesting that our conversation drifted so far into the community direction and the network space, and just want to maybe bring it back a little bit to the primal polarity and bring it back to the ground in some sense, because I do think in any practical sense, the way I feel is that a deep network and a healthy long-term network is going to involve primal polarity. It's going to involve people who can be in touch with the source of the primal energy in polarity, the unity in the polarity, and can sustain it across time, and decades of time, and ideally a lifetime. Now, in that context, one of the biggest challenges we've already brought up is in the contemporary dynamic, and I think this is one of the biggest dialectical oscillations in history. We've gone from a religious landscape where women could not get divorced to a post-religious landscape where women initiate all the divorces, basically. Not all the divorces, but many of the divorces. What's going on there, and what is your thinking on how we can think through that issue?
Yeah, this is a big one, and yeah, majority of divorces statistically are initiated by women. That's a fact. Why this is, I think, comes back to the kind of evolutionary dynamic of mate switching. So as a man, theoretically, you're fertile to the day you die, right? So you can just continue to have children. You can continue to, date younger and younger, more fertile women. And many men do this. This is why men initiate divorces, is they're sexually unsatisfied, or actually the primary reason men report that they get divorced is the woman doesn't respect them anymore. It's interesting to see this. Women don't feel loved or seen or safe by men, and so often will want to leave them. Men want to feel respected. So if your wife has lost respect for you, she doesn't want to have sex with you, she doesn't really respect your work, she doesn't respect who you are as a man, that's not a viable mate anymore. And so that's why a lot of divorces happen. The divorce space is interesting because you've made a contract, right, you've said, I'm going to be with this person legally, emotionally, sexually, and we've committed to this container we've created. When the container then becomes unviable, or someone's growing or having a midlife crisis, or there's been a breach in trust, maybe there's been an infidelity, now the contract has to be renegotiated. And some people will stay together for the children. So for many reasons, they'll financially not want to, lose half their assets. So they'll try to make it work. And that's often where couples therapy or whatever happens. I think a lot of people will, maybe get triggered by this, but women they stand to gain more potentially from a divorce. The man may have had more assets than them. I mean, the women who've made the most money in history of divorced billionaires, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, she had the biggest divorce settlement of all time. She got half his assets legally, some billions. And so women stand to gain more financially. If there's children, and especially if there's some kind of like violent or abusive dynamic, they want to protect the children. So they need to remove that from the man. And women, if they mate switch, are more likely after the divorce to actually meet a partner that suits their needs, even if they're quote unquote downgrading, even though in the idea of hypergamy, right, women want to date across or up hierarchies. So they actually want to, trade in for the new model, a man who's more successful, more attractive, more grounded in his masculinity. And you do see this happening where, I've worked with clients who recently divorced, and it can be a crippling and painful process to just realize that their wife left them for a man that was more on his path or more powerful in some sense in his friendships, his finances, his physicality, his commitments. And often for men on the positive side, that's a huge impetus for growth, because they were kind of on autopilot, oblivious to all the little subtle dynamics that women on average are a little better at picking up. Women are much better at understanding body language, implicit meaning, emotional dynamics. So they're tracking all this stuff. And this is the sad part, is they just weren't communicating it. And this is why learning communication and being radically honest and speaking with authentic relating and emotional intelligence is so key to relationship health, because a lot of this stuff just builds up, resentment, disrespect, sexual fantasies, and then it explodes in a divorce because there was no buildup or like linkage to all these subconscious dynamics that were happening in the partners. So unfortunately, divorce is an industry as well. Divorce law is highly profitable, which again brings it back to the capitalist dynamics where, it's tragic that some men go into bankruptcy because courts will favor always giving more assets to the women, especially if there's children involved. And this is why some of the masculinist movements on the extreme side think that there's like a war against men because the state and law favors women, which is mainly around children. And I understand why it's set up that way. I don't think it has bad intentions. Now, the implementation of it sometimes is, catastrophic.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And it's interesting to note that when men initiate divorce, it seems to be around disrespect. Respect is incredibly important for men. To feel
it's a primary currency.
Yeah, it's our primary currency. I think so. To feel respected sexually, to feel respected in your career, what you've decided to do, and of course, the reason why respect has such a high currency for us, because it's in some sense it's easier to make money than to earn respect. Like if you've genuinely earned respect, you can't buy that. You can't buy that. So there's a reason why it's so important for us, and you can't just get it. You can't just get it. It's something you have to earn. And it's interesting that blind spot for men who are not on their path is often the same motivator for growth. So in your primal polarity group, you say that one of the things you focus on is the alchemy of painful blind spots, which can be in some sense seeing the train before it hits you, to catch the blind spot before it wipes you out. So can you go into a little bit about what you've seen there? What are the dynamics involved in catching the blind spots and alchemizing it, to use your language?
Yeah, this is the part of shadow work that's the most uncomfortable, is admitting where you're repeating patterns or the things that trigger you often are signifiers of unmet emotional pain. And it goes back to childhood, it goes back to the mother-father relationship, but it often is most evident in past relationships. So, one of the things I usually teach is a forgiveness ritual of doing inquiry, meditating, practicing, whatever that looks like for you. It's very personal. And then often writing a letter to the past partner. Usually it's one, the big love that hurt the most, and writing a letter of forgiveness to them, and using that as an emotional jump off point to feeling those emotions. Because often the emotions, like emotional energy, is very mysterious, and it's a kind of a feminine force. I see it as like the Eros, or the life force. The emotions have energy and information. They're not random, although they are irrational and they're non-logical and non-linear, but they're non-random. They have meaning, and they have a purpose. Evolution didn't waste anything, or you could call it God, whatever. It's not wasteful. So the emotion has energy, and it just wants to be felt. Most people aren't afraid of the past partner or the ex-wife. They're afraid of how they felt with the past partner, ex-husband, whatever. And they're afraid of feeling that. Oh, can I really let myself feel so much shame or guilt or disgust or, self-loathing, whatever. And what you find is you have a big cry, you have a rage, maybe you need to beat a pillow and scream. Maybe you need to sit in silence and just like let your nervous system fully relax, and you'll feel the emotion, and then it's gone. And the hooks it had in you, or the charge that was driving addictive behaviors or avoidant, anxious, codependent behaviors, it loses all its power. And then you can just be like, what the fuck was that? And then you can go into more the psychological and logical side, where it's like, okay, well, that happened because my dad did this, and then I formed this belief about men that caused me to date all these men, and then I got into abusive, so it creates this telos of your relationship history. And it's very valuable once you kind of start to unlock that. The dynamics that happen the most, I would say, are emasculation. So men feeling emasculated, domineered, disrespected by women. Women who maybe sexually or emotionally manipulate them to get their needs met or protect themselves from pain. And the men allow the dynamic. This is the most painful side for the masculine I see with clients, is men waking up to the fact that they're allowing themselves to be, emasculated, made less than, disrespected, brought low, forcing to play small, subdue their masculine power and dominance energy, which is very natural and healthy if it's expressed well. But the women, out of fear of that, will nitpick, nag, bite, like tear that energy down. On the feminine side, it's often women become doormats, or there's submissive devotion energy of surrendering to love, wanting to be the nurturer, be that amazing lover and supporter of their man. It goes into the shadow, and they become disempowered. They become addicted or codependent with the partner, and they lose completely all their female relationships, and they get stuck. They might become dependent on them financially, and without the healthy dynamics in place, they just become a husk of themselves, and they shut down sexually, they shut down emotionally, and become very small, and they shut down their voice. So for a lot of women, it's about reclaiming that.
It's fantastically insightful. I also think that that's potentially involved in the triggering around dominance and submission, that men can feel emasculated, disrespected, and women can become a doormat, which would be the extreme negative side of submission. And of course, emasculation being the extreme negative side of, I suppose, that's one of not being able to be dominant, not being able to step into your dominance in a healthy way. I suppose a man might also feel some shame or guilt around being too dominant if he was too dominant in that way. But in any case, I think it's very insightful to think about how you alchemize the painful blind spots. Now, potentially connected, but I think this is a really important thing to go into here, is what is that you've already mentioned that it's really important to actually have done the self-work to know what your deepest needs and desires are, or at least have some understanding. of your deepest needs and desires. You may never know it fully necessarily, but at least be in contact with it. What's the difference between wanting to have your deepest needs met and wanting to have your deepest desires met? Do you make a distinction there? And when your deepest needs and desires encounter incompatibilities with the other, how, or an irreconcilable difference? I always thought it was interesting that marriages often end on the idea of irreconcilable differences. What happens in your experience, and how do you navigate through, on the one hand, trying to meet your deepest needs and desires, on the other hand, confronting real differences and incompatibilities?
Yeah, this is a great line of thinking that I'm fascinated by, because I find human psychology deeply fascinating. And for me, needs are non-negotiable. They're core needs. And you can look at the frame of love languages. You can look at the frame of attachment style for this. Attachment theory has a lot to say. Like, for some people, they just need physical touch. Like, they need to be touched, not even necessarily sexually, just touch is extremely important to them. It's important for all humans, but some more than others. Another need would be like words of affirmation or validation. They need to be verbally seen and loved by a partner. And when you shut down needs or shame yourself or feel guilty for having them, you are completely hamstringing yourself, and you will never be able to, have a healthy relationship, because these needs go so deep. They go all the way back to when we were children and infants. They're deep core things that you have to have a base level of psychological and emotional health. So if you don't know what those are, I mean, you're in trouble, because how are you going to get them met? And then once you do know what they are, then it's about skillfully getting them met and asking for them, right? Needs go very deep, and it's often very primal stuff. It's very much about self-image, self-worth, touch. It can be about sexuality and desire and emotion as well, but it's very like core need level stuff. Desires are a little different. Desires can be things you want. They're not non-negotiable, but you really desire them. Now, unmet desires that are strong, if they're left in the unconscious too long, or you never talk about them, then they can kind of turn towards a need and actually sabotage a relationship. So desires you can really play and explore. Desires are fun to play with because they have a lot of like erotic energy, or they have a lot of life force energy, and they can express in many ways. Like, desires aren't so kind of clear cut as I would say a need is, in terms of how it is expressed or received. So, you can go into things like, your desire for being courted and dated even after committing in a partnership. You can go into the desire of, you really want to have adventures with your partner. You want to have new experiences, exotic experiences. You want to have different kinds of sexual experiences, and you get into all the kinds of kinks and sexual play aspects that, are needed for that healthy kind of zest polarity relationship. If you just stay vanilla and like you never go into your desire, you're afraid to claim desire. A lot of desires come with shame, because you're like, if I try to claim this desire with my partner, would they leave me? Would it be too much? A lot of women are afraid of being too much with desire. A lot of men are ashamed, like, oh, if I want this, does it make me not a good boy, right? If I want to go into BDSM or whatever. So the desire space is really important. And I often facilitate for couples and clients a space where they individually make an inventory and reflect on these, and then present them to each other in a non-judgmental space of open communication. And 9 times out of 10, there might be a few that like, ooh, that's a little edgy, I don't know about that. But most of the time, both partners love it, and they're super amenable to it. And actually, all the fears and shame were just in your head because you hadn't revealed it to the other. And in a loving space, your partner, if you're in a healthy, like, they want to make you happy because that's going to bring them happiness, right? It's that kind of like eudaimonia, like it's a self-regulating, self-accelerating energy. When both partners are experiencing pleasure and desire, it begets more of itself. So you're selling yourself short when you don't share these things. Now,
I was going to say, let's get into the where. Now there's 9 out of the 10 times, then there's the 1 out of the 10 times where you hit a deep incompatibility and an irreconcilable difference. How do you handle that?
Yeah, and this is tough because you can't fake compatibility. You can't engineer it. And I'm very much in the kind of teaching style with my more advanced clients who are kind of past the 101. I really advocate for courtship. So if you are in a dating space, compatibility is everything. And I've experienced this personally with my relationship history, where you can't outwork incompatibility in a relationship. It's just never going to happen. You can't outcompete incompatible, deep core needs that are mismatched. And this is tricky because of the dynamics of trauma bonding. And this has been well researched, where like people literally get high and get off on the adrenaline and the cortisol that comes along with pain bonding with someone sexually, where they're scratching that exact itch that you had with your mom or dad or with a family member, whatever, that you need this desire met. They won't fulfill it, but in the pain of trying to fulfill it, you can kind of get into this infatuation. And I've experienced this, and I know a lot of people have experienced this, and it's a quite common experience. It doesn't mean you're fucked up. It just means when you discover the incompatibility and there's an irreconcilable difference, as you're saying, the right thing to do is get support. If you really love each other and you want to work on it, yes, like hire a therapist, hire a coach, go through a program, go to an event together, expand, open, ask for help and support. You can still operate in a healthy dynamic with a quote unquote core incompatibility. You just will have to know that if you can't meet that need for each other, someone else will have to. That doesn't mean you need to take on another sexual partner. It just means you're going to have to be more resourced into the village. And this is one of the traps a lot of couples get into, is they just stop hanging out with their friends, stop having mentors, stop working with anyone, and just go all in on each other. And that makes it worse. There are some, though, that you are not a good fit to date or be married, whatever. And the right thing to do is to uncouple amicably and with respect and care. And that's where the hardest part comes. How can you have care and love for someone even as you break your bond? And unfortunately, a lot of people are like, oh, this is incompatible. I can't reconcile this difference. Well, I don't want to confront the negative emotion, so fuck it. We'll just stay unhappily married for 10 more years before it becomes a crisis. And that's unfortunately reality for a lot of folks.
Yeah, that's not a very nice place to be. And unfortunately, I think it's a common place for many people, because as hard as it is to find a deep loving relationship, sometimes it's just as hard to break a relationship, sometimes even harder to break a relationship, because even if you're the one who's initiating it, that feeling of loss and that feeling of pain can just be as strong, no matter if you're the one breaking up or the one being broken up with, and can have a long-standing ripple effect on your emotional life. But there's something winding down, I suppose now. There's something I wanted to bring up with you that's inspired. For those who follow my channel, they'll know I'm teaching a course on Hegel's Science of Logic. And there's an interesting pattern of logic which repeats in the book, which moves from, basically, we could say, diversity of identity to opposition or polarity of identity to contradiction of identity. So you have diversity of identity, opposition of identity, contradiction of identity. And we've already moved through in this conversation how diversity of identity is an ideological shield, perhaps, for polarity and opposition, where we really confront, as we've talked, primal polarity. Now, in the logic, it moves from that to contradiction of identity. Now, what I want to propose to you and throw out here is this movement from polarity to contradiction, and throw out the idea that the movement from polarity to contradiction involves the child. Because you have polarity, which is obviously the polarity between a masculine and feminine primal energy. And then that primal energy is a contradiction of both of those identities, because ultimately it's serving the child, which is in some sense a transformation of that identity into an other identity. What do you make of that? And does that come up in your work?
Yeah, I think this is fascinating as the dialectic model. It, on one level, it's just simply because this is how the species propagates. So why are these drives so strong and overwhelming? Well, it's because they create new humans. And like that on a practical level is obvious, but is deeply meaningful. If we didn't have these oppositional polarizing dynamics between men and women and masculine and feminine, would the species have ended a long time ago? And that's an interesting idea. And there's so much pain that comes with it and confusion because our ancestors were trying to figure it out too. Here we are, millions of years into the human experiment, right? Or however far back it goes where you want to draw the line. And we still haven't figured this shit out. And we've been doing it the whole time, from that first caveman date where he brought a hunk of meat home and that cave woman kind of looked at him and gave him the wink. And, they jumped in the furs together, all the way up until now where the guy's on Tinder swiping right on hundreds of women in his community and just going on a bender of multiplicity. There's still so much to work out because of how complex a single human being is. And then you put two human beings together in a polarized dynamic, and now you have like the 10,000 things. So I think children, for many people, are an initiation. I know it will be for me. I do want to be a father. I will be one day. And, it's an initiation because suddenly there's something to work towards other than yourself or other than your partner. So the third energy is a funnel for the creative forces of legacy. And I think this hits deeper for the masculine on one level, because from the masculine, it's about immortality and legacy. History forgets 99% of people. We can't even name most of the people that have ever lived. We know nothing about them. And so there is this drive as the masculine to create a legacy, to provide for the future. And the indigenous have this idea that everything we do, every action we're working towards is for 7 generations moving forward. And that's kind of the compass. That's actually the dharmic, thing on which to measure your action, which I think is very poetic and beautiful. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. For women, though, because they bear the children, literally, they grow this being in their body and are the primary care provider for the beginning of their life. Literally, they're giving them sustenance through their breast. For women, it's the most deeply loving and devotional act of their life. Most women say that being a mother is the most important thing they will and have ever done. And the focus then goes away from the man, this devotional husband, boyfriend, partner that they love so much and want to nurture and care for and just open to. It goes towards the child. And then it sets up this dynamic between the three. And I think it's why so many of us had let us say less than ideal family dynamics growing up, because our parents were trying to navigate this field, which can be very full of emotional energy and needs, desires, and all of it is all mixed up with the child now too, who has become the focus in some sense for both parents.
And I think I want to bring this conversation full circle to get your perspective on this. So you started your journey growing up Catholic. And then you went on, you grew up in less than ideal, or let's say there's less than ideal family dynamics, there's repression. And you go out into the world and you go on a hero's journey and explore all sorts of different spiritualities. And now there's roots forming, and you're saying confronting the child will be an initiation. What do you think your relationship to Christianity is here? What's your relationship to Christianity after having a child, do you think? Can you anticipate? Do you see anything in your current field which is pointing in that direction, or are you pointing in a different direction? Because I think this is super important, because like you said, so we've gone from the polarity to the 3, which brings us to a contradiction. And of course, in Christianity, they have a Trinity, which is perhaps not as explicitly relevant to the dynamics between man, woman, and child that I think psychoanalysis with the Oedipus complex has a trinity, which is the man, woman, and the father, the mother, and the child. And in my own quest, it's, to me, the real spiritual challenge, or the real, I would even say, scientific challenge in a Hegelian sense, in a spiritual sense, is, can we do family better than traditional religion? That, to me, is the $1 trillion question. And I think actually a lot of my, I'll say this, I think a lot of my philosophical work hangs on this. I think that's what my philosophical work is about. So I'd like to get your opinion on this.
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, I will say, like, my relationship to Christianity now is one of respect and gratitude. Like, I learned a lot about myself by going through that lens through Catholicism. I don't actually resent it, or, I went through that phase of like rebellion, fuck you. And like, I look at it now, and I've been deeply influenced by thinkers like Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau, John Vervaeke, where they are interviewing like these Jesuit priests and going deeply into the psychological significance and the symbology and the mythology of Christianity, which is rich and vast. And I love it. I do love this idea of, the Christian story is extremely powerful. Resurrection, redemption, forgiveness, the transcendental, entering the world and penetrating it. I mean, there's a lot there. And I've also gone deep into like kind of the Gnostic and Essene kind of, traditions. And I'm fascinated by it, just as a philosopher and a geek, and a nerd. I love that stuff. I love mythology in all its forms. That being said, like, what Christianity's effects have been on the family, on polarity, and on humanity, I mean, it's a hard case to make that it's been net positive. It's created a ton of unhealthy dynamics. I mean, even look at how many pedophiles have been revealed in the church. It's like the worst thing you could possibly imagine. It's like the men of God are actually these demonic fucking predators. So like that whole system, I will not hold any of those values on display for my sons and daughters. I will let them choose their own path to relate to God, to relate to the transcendental, to relate to, the religious dimension. I'll strive to be an embodiment of what I've learned, which is not Christian in its entirety. I've learned a lot from Eastern traditions. I've learned a lot from nature and indigenous traditions as well. And I want to, pay that forward in my family dynamic. That being said, there are things to glean from the traditional Christian family values that are valuable now, outside of the context of the religion, repression, tithing, and all the dogmatic shit. And it's funny because there's liberal publications now that will run these articles of the trad wife movement, or the trad husband, where it's like women are quitting their jobs and wanting to become submissive housewives. And it's like this like clickbait. But there's a reason a lot of women are into that. There's a huge movement right now. This is a whole nother podcast, of born again people from the New Age, where born again people suddenly go all the way back to Christian. People I know personally who sat in ayahuasca ceremonies and did fucking MDMA psychotherapy and went into BDSM workshops, and they denounce it all as satanic now and evil, and they refound Jesus, and Jesus is the only way. This is happening like crazy in the New Age community right now, where a lot of people are, in my analysis of it, by opening the unconscious so wide and going on these, panoplies of experience and hedonism, they go back to the last moment where they felt safe and sane with a daddy figure or an authority that they could understand. And so they denounced all that, or they had a traumatic experience with psychedelics often, or sexuality. And so they go back to the traditional Christian values. Now, I don't think that's healthy, and probably just as dangerous of a cult as the sex cults or the Burning Man communities, whatever. I don't think Christianity is necessarily better or worse, but I do think that some of the traditional family values of a man who's connected to God and purpose, protects and covers his family and his wife with love, provides for them, a woman who has devotion to God through her man, and there's a love dynamic that forms there of deep respect and like spiritual power. there's a lot to be gained there. So we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think Christianity still has something to teach us, even now, as postmodern, cynical capitalists that are doing our thing.
Yeah, I like the nuance you bring to the question and the problem, and I think you hold a very interesting position within the complex spiritual webs of our contemporary world. So it's I think this conversation has been important. I think your work is important. For anyone interested in getting involved with Kevin, I'll leave links to his Primal Polarity container in the description. And is there anything else that you would like to leave the viewers with about this work and about what they might be on the lookout for in the future?
Yeah, I'm really grateful to be here with you, Cadell, and I always love having these conversations, these dialogos. What I would recommend, like as the ground to all of this, if you're listening to this or you're in Cadell's channel and you're in the philosophy portal and you're interested in this work, is just get involved with men's and women's work. Maybe you're not ready to go on like a deep tantric intimacy journey and reveal all your traumas and kind of walk some of the paths we've meandered through in this conversation. It's intense, and I don't recommend it to everyone. Some people need to get their base levels on point, like hydration, sleep, emotional regulation, your work. But I do think every man and every woman would be well served to be vulnerable, authentic, and have loving relationships with other men and women in the context of, it can be a formal men and women circle. It can be just your friends where you set spaces to have conversations like this. And I think that's another gift that, our book with Daniel gives a lot of people, and how, Alexander Bard kind of referred to it as, it's a great conversational framework to have these conversations. So that's what I would recommend at the most basic level to folks.
All right. Well, it's been a great experience having this conversation. I think primal polarity is an important topic and occupies an important moment right now. And I suppose on that note, we'll close it up. I just want to say that Kevin here has been on this path for a while, and I think that what this conversation has shown is that he's someone who is a leader in this space, and I think can navigate these energies with care and responsibility. So thank you for your work, Kevin, and for everyone watching, thank you, and hope you have a great day.